Okay, now that our radiator is in, before we put on our upper hose, we need to put our power steering line back to where it goes. So I left this disconnected. This is still hanging out. Our hose is not put on yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck this underneath the intake boot, under the mass airflow sensor, around the oil fill tube, and under the radiator hose. Once we have that in place, we have our screw at the oil fill tube and another screw on the top of the cam casing that secures that line in place. And then all we have left to do from there is plug in our reservoir return line, which is just a simple tension band clamp, and then our fitting here, once again using our 17mm and our 19mm to torque it up. There is an O-ring on there. Make sure that O-ring does not get lost or damaged, because that is integral to how well this thing seals up. Now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and put our radiator hose on. We can drop our charcoal canister back into its bracket. Make sure to feed the hose down in a way that it's not riding up on the timing belt. Clip this into place. Slide the intake boot onto the mass airflow sensor, which is easiest to do when you have the airbox unclipped. And then now we have it there, we can go ahead and fasten the airbox down. Sometimes these can be a bit tricky the way the air filter fits in there. But you'll know if it's fitting or if you know if it's not fitting by the way it clamps down. Okay, as we continue along this side of the engine to tighten everything up, we have a vacuum line here that connects here. This supplies the vacuum canister, which operates your dashboard vents and your, if this were a push button 4-wheel drive, the vacuum solenoids that takes care of that. Now that I'm here, I'm going to slide the heater hoses on, because everything around that is routed properly. As you can see, the AC routes over the top of everything. The starter cables run underneath everywhere. Now that we have these heater hoses on, we can go ahead and tighten those down, and we will have a closed cooling system to where we can go ahead and add coolant. Okay, now I'm onto the throttle cable. Where it fits under here, I'm just mainly showing you where the proper routing is. What you're looking at is a close-up of the side of the throttle body, just ahead of the EGR. You can see the throttle spring and the throttle itself right here. So I have my cable. Before I stick her down in her mount all the way, I'm going to use the slack end of it and fit it in the little hole on the throttle piece, which is very similar to a cable on a bicycle, and let it fall into the groove underneath this little tab. And then once that's there, I can go ahead and tighten down my throttle cable bracket to get the appropriate length. With a little bit of slack. You don't want it too tight, otherwise you know you're going to have part throttle on when you're off the gas. It's easier to get to if you pull the boot up. Otherwise, if you know what you're doing enough, you can get that on there without pulling the boot out of the way. Snap all of our hoses back together and tighten the clamps, and this car is just a few steps away from being able to run. We have our battery cables. We have a ground cable here. We have our alternator connectors here. I'm going to start with the fuel lines. They're all kind of tied together with the brake line, booster line, and we also have our gas tank vent line. I'm going to start with the gas tank vent line. We're going to go under the starter cable and over the top of this bracket, and she plugs right into this metal line. It's coming up at a 45-degree angle from the intake manifold, which this runs across and over under the manifold out to the charcoal canister, and that is a tension band clamp. You just squeeze that down with a pair of pliers. Next we have our fuel lines. If you notice, there are two lines. One line comes from the filter, the other one comes directly off the firewall. The one off the filter is obviously our supply line. Well, naturally assuming you think the one on the top on the SPFI body here is the supply line, but no, that's the return line. And the reason is this is our fuel pressure regulator, and on the Subaru, fuel pressure regulator is after the injector. So our bottom line for single port fuel injection, SPFI, is going to connect on the bottom for our fuel supply line. And then the other line you have here is going to be for the return. These are going to route under the air conditioning hard lines here. Now that we have all those lines connected, those are in place, our last one here is our brake booster line, which is going to plug right onto the top of the intake, just to the right of our bolt that holds down the AC compressor. There's a retaining bracket like this that holds all these lines down into place. You got a little tab that fits into a groove, and then it'll go across the top, and then a small screw holds that down. 8mm screw with the hex. Usually when coming apart, you're going to use the 8mm to break the torque, but going together you can just screw it down with a screwdriver. That'll be fine. And now we have all those in place. Once I snap the clamps down, tension clamps with a pair of pliers, we can go ahead and plug our PCV line back into all of this. And now all of our hoses on this car are completely hooked up. That leaves us with the electrical connections, which are going to be the alternator. Plug that fitting into there, and then you have an eyelet fitting here for the voltage. It's going to thread onto here with an 8mm. I recommend you do this before installing your battery, or if you do have a battery on board, pull the negative cable so you don't ground out on anything. This leaves us with another plug down here, if you can see. Hopefully you can. This goes to our distributor. Your 1988s and up are going to have a square style plug, whereas your 87s no, they're going to have a round style plug. So if you swap a distributor, make sure you have a matching plug. Otherwise, the pigtail in this distributor itself can be swapped to match. And last but not least, we have our two harness connectors for the engine. This controls our SPFI. They're going to plug in right below the between the coil and the coolant overflow jug. And then we have one more ground cable here. This unclips from a wire going towards the coil, but since we yanked the whole motor and this other connector goes with it, I just undid it from the bolt. So this bolts down to the water pipe from the water pump with a single 12mm bolt. Now our vehicle is entirely electrically connected to the car, and aside from not having coolant in this car and not having oil in the car and not having the belts on, it's ready to start once we connect the coil wire here.